Katherine Walsh knew the moment the stagecoach crossed into Wyoming territory that there was no turning back. Not to Philadelphia, not to the life she'd left in ruins, not to the scandal that would follow her name for generations if she'd stayed. The August heat of 1878 pressed against the leather curtains as dust swirled through the gaps, coating her navy traveling dress in a fine layer of grit that matched the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She'd been running for 3 weeks now, each mile putting distance between her and the truth that had shattered her world like fine china against marble floors. The other passengers in the cramped coach were a sleeping salesman who smelled of whiskey and cheap cologne, and an elderly woman who'd introduced herself as Mrs. Pendleton before promptly ignoring Katherine for the remainder of the journey. Katherine preferred it that way. The fewer questions asked, the fewer lies she'd have to tell. Her fingers traced the outline of the small leather pouch hidden in her skirt pocket, containing everything she had left in the world. $43, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, and a letter of introduction to a schoolteacher position in a town she'd never heard of until desperation had made her respond to the advertisement. El Dorado. Wyoming wasn't much to look at when the stagecoach finally rattled to a stop in front of a weathered building that served as both post office and general store. Katherine stepped down onto the dusty main street, her legs trembling from hours of being folded into the cramped space, and surveyed what was to be her new home. The town consisted of perhaps 24 buildings lining a single wide street, with smaller structures scattered behind like afterthoughts. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat, and the air smelled different here, sharp and clean in a way that Philadelphia's smoke-choked streets never had. Miss Walsh. A round woman in a faded calico dress approached, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "I'm Margaret Henley. I run the boarding house. The school committee asked me to meet you." Katherine forced a smile, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must appear after 3 weeks of travel. "Mrs. Henley. Thank you for meeting me. I'm afraid the journey was rather longer than I anticipated." "They always are, dear. Come along, let me show you to your room. You'll want to wash up before dinner, and the committee wants to meet with you tomorrow morning." Mrs. Henley picked up one of Katherine's bags with surprising strength for her age. "We're all excited to have a proper teacher from back east. The children have been making do with whatever education their parents can provide, but it's not the same as having someone trained." "If only you knew how little training I truly have," Katherine thought, but kept her expression pleasant as she followed Mrs. Henley down the street. The teaching certificate in her trunk was real enough, earned during 2 years at a women's seminary, before her father's business had prospered enough to pull her out and introduce her to Philadelphia society. What felt like a lifetime ago now, though only 5 years had passed since she'd been that naive girl of 18, dreaming of education and purpose. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that had seen better days but maintained a certain dignity despite its weathered exterior. The room Mrs. Henley showed her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. After weeks of sleeping in way-station bunks and the cramped stagecoach, it felt like luxury. "Dinner's at 6, Mrs. Henley said, setting the bag on the bed. "We have 4 other boarders currently, all men, but they're respectful. I don't tolerate any nonsense under my roof." "Of course not," Katherine said, already unpinning her hat. The dark brown hair beneath was hopelessly tangled, and she knew the dust had left streaks across her face. "Thank you, Mrs. Henley." After the door closed, Katherine sank onto the bed and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of doubt. 1 minute to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake, if she should have stayed and faced the consequences, if running made her a coward. Then she stood, poured water from the pitcher into the basin, and began to wash away the evidence of her journey. She'd made her choice. She would live with it. Dinner was a subdued affair. The other boarders barely looked up from their plates when Mrs. Henley introduced Katherine as the new schoolteacher. She was grateful for their disinterest, eating the simple but well-prepared meal of beef stew and biscuits in silence. Tomorrow, she would need to be charming and competent for the school committee. Tonight, she just needed to not fall apart. Sleep came easier than expected, exhaustion finally claiming her despite the unfamiliar sounds of the town outside her window. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the thin curtains, and she could hear the sounds of El Dorado coming to life. Horses in the street, voices calling greetings, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. It was so different from Philadelphia's cacophony that it felt like waking in another world entirely. She dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a dove-gray cotton that made her blue eyes appear darker. Her hair, finally washed and properly brushed, she pinned into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. The face in the small mirror above the washstand looked thinner than she remembered, her cheekbones more prominent, but there was a determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Whatever else she'd lost in these past weeks, she'd found something resembling strength. The school committee consisted of 5 men, all prominent citizens of El Dorado according to Mrs. Henley's whispered commentary. The meeting took place in the general store, which also served as a gathering place for town business. They asked her about her education, her teaching philosophy, her willingness to work with children of various ages in a single classroom. Katherine answered with a confidence she didn't entirely feel, drawing on half-remembered lessons from her seminary days and hoping it would be enough. "The school building is just down the street," one of the committee members said, a banker named Mr. Thornton. "It's not much, but we built it ourselves 2 years ago. Been waiting for the right teacher to make proper use of it." "I'm certain it will be more than adequate," Katherine said, meaning it. After everything she'd been through, a simple building and the opportunity to teach felt like an unexpected gift. The tour of the schoolhouse revealed a single large room with rough-hewn benches, a teacher's desk that wobbled slightly when touched, and a blackboard that had seen better days. But there were windows that let in good light, a wood stove for winter, and shelves waiting to be filled with books. Katherine could work with this. "Classes start in 2 weeks, Mr. Thornton explained. "That should give you time to settle in and prepare. We'll expect you to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography at minimum. Some of the older children might be nearly your age, Miss Walsh." "I hope that won't be a problem." "Not at all," Katherine assured him, though privately she wondered what she'd gotten herself into. At 23, she wasn't that much older than some students might be. But she needed this position, needed the stability and purpose it offered, needed the distance it put between her and Philadelphia. The committee seemed satisfied with her answers, and by the time they dismissed her, Katherine was officially the teacher of El Dorado's one-room schoolhouse. She walked back to the boarding house feeling lighter than she had in weeks, as if signing the teaching contract had sealed her transformation from Katherine Walsh of Philadelphia to Miss Walsh, frontier schoolteacher. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Katherine cleaned the schoolhouse from top to bottom, organized the few supplies the town had managed to collect, and began planning lessons for students whose abilities she could only guess at. Mrs. Henley proved to be a wealth of information about the town's families, though Katherine noticed the older woman seemed particularly interested in discussing the eligible bachelors of the area, despite Katherine's repeated assertions that she had no interest in romance. A pretty young thing like you won't stay unmarried long out here, Mrs. Henley predicted as they snapped beans on the boarding house porch one evening. Men outnumber women 3-1 in these parts. You'll have your pick. Katherine kept her eyes on her work, not wanting to explain that the very last thing she wanted was another man in her life. I'm here to teach, Mrs. Henley. That's quite enough for me. On her 8th day in El Dorado, Katherine's carefully constructed peace shattered. She was in the general store, purchasing slate pencils for the school when the door opened and 3 men entered. She wouldn't have paid them much attention except that the shopkeeper's expression changed, becoming simultaneously more alert and more cautious. "Mr. Donovan," the shopkeeper said with careful neutrality. "What can I do for you? Just need some supplies, Pete. We've got a herd coming through next week." The man who spoke was tall, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of spring grass. He wore dusty work clothes and moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His gaze passed over Katherine with polite disinterest before returning to the shopkeeper. Katherine told herself that the flutter in her chest was just surprise at the interruption, nothing more. She'd learned her lesson about handsome men with easy confidence. Learned it in the most painful way possible. She gathered her purchases quickly, paid, and slipped past the men toward the door. She almost made it. "Madam." The tall man, Donovan, stepped slightly to the side, creating space for her to pass. Close enough that she caught the scent of leather and sage, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her best intentions. "Thank you," she murmured, not meeting his eyes, and escaped into the sunlight. Back at the schoolhouse, she tried to focus on her preparations, but her mind kept drifting to Green Eyes and the way he'd moved with such casual grace. She scolded herself firmly. She was here to start over, not to repeat old mistakes. Men like that, handsome and confident, were exactly the kind she needed to avoid. The first day of school arrived with unseasonable coolness, a hint of the autumn to come threading through the morning air. Katherine arrived at the schoolhouse an hour before she'd told students to appear, needing the time to settle her nerves. She'd taught before, in a limited capacity during her seminary days, but this felt different, more real, more permanent. Students began arriving in clusters, some walking from town, others delivered by parents in wagons. Katherine greeted each one at the door, learning names and ages, trying to assess reading levels with a few quick questions. By the time she rang the bell to begin, she had 17 students ranging from 6-year-old Emma Patterson to 16-year-old Thomas Gray. The challenge ahead felt enormous, but Katherine welcomed it. Challenge meant distraction, and distraction was exactly what she needed. The morning went better than she'd dared hope. The children were well behaved, if rough around the edges, and genuinely eager to learn. Katherine divided them into 3 groups based on ability rather than age, and by noon, she felt she'd established a reasonable structure for the school day. At lunch, while the children ate outside in the sunshine, Katherine remained at her desk, reviewing the afternoon's planned lessons. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice someone had entered until a throat cleared politely. She looked up to find the man from the general store, Donovan, standing just inside the doorway holding his hat. In the better light, she could see the sun-weathered lines around his eyes, the strong line of his jaw, and the way his work-roughened hands turned the hat brim in a gesture that seemed almost nervous. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Miss Walsh," he said, his voice a low rumble that did unfortunate things to her composure. "I'm Jackson Donovan. I own the cattle ranch about 5 miles west of town. Mr. Donovan." Katherine stood, smoothing her skirts, trying to project professional competence while her heart did an irritating dance in her chest. "How can I help you? I wanted to talk to you about my daughter." He glanced toward the windows where children's laughter filtered in. "Sarah. She's 10, the girl with the dark braids. She should have been here this morning, but she refused to come." Of all the things Katherine had expected him to say, that wasn't it. A daughter. He had a daughter. Of course he did. Probably a wife too, though she noticed no ring on his finger. Not that she was looking. "I see," she said carefully. "Can you tell me why she refused?" Jackson's expression tightened. "Her mother died 2 years ago. Sarah's been different since then. Quiet, stubborn. She used to love learning, but now she says she doesn't need school, that she's going to be a rancher like me, and ranchers don't need book learning." There was such pain in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable, that Katherine felt her defensive walls crack slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Donovan, both of you. Thank you." He met her eyes directly, and Katherine saw grief there, but also determination. "I want better for Sarah than I had. I can barely write my own name, Miss Walsh. I don't want that for my daughter. But I don't know how to make her understand." Katherine considered for a moment, an idea forming. "Would you bring her tomorrow? Not for regular classes, just to meet me, see the schoolhouse. Sometimes children resist because the unknown frightens them." "She's not frightened," Jackson said with a hint of pride. "That girl's braver than most grown men I know, but she's hurting, and I don't always know how to reach her anymore." The admission seemed to cost him something, this strong, capable man confessing his struggles with his daughter. Katherine recognized the feeling. Wasn't she running from her own kind of hurt, her own inability to fix what was broken? "Bring her tomorrow after regular school hours," Katherine said gently. "Say around 4 o'clock. We'll just talk. No pressure, no expectations." Jackson's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I appreciate that, Miss Walsh. We'll be here." After he left, Katherine found it difficult to focus on the afternoon lessons. Her mind kept drifting to Jackson Donovan and his grieving daughter, to the pain in his green eyes and the quiet strength in how he held himself together. She reminded herself firmly that this was professional concern, nothing more. A teacher interested in helping a student. The fact that the student's father made her pulse race was entirely irrelevant. That evening, Mrs. Henley had thoughts about Katherine's visitor. "Jackson Donovan came to see you, did he?" the older woman said over dinner, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Now there's a catch, if you don't mind me saying. Best rancher in the county and handsome to boot. Lost his wife Martha to fever 2 years back. Tragic thing, she was a sweet girl. He wants his daughter to attend school," Katherine said firmly, trying to discourage the matchmaking gleam in Mrs. Henley's eye. "That's the extent of our connection." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Henley said, entirely too innocently. "Though I will say he hasn't shown interest in any woman since Martha died. The fact that he came to see you himself, rather than sending a ranch hand with a message, that's interesting." Katherine chose not to respond, but later, alone in her room, she found herself thinking about what Mrs. Henley had said. Jackson Donovan had loved his wife. Was still grieving her 2 years later. That kind of devotion, that depth of feeling, it was something Katherine had thought existed only in novels. Certainly it wasn't what she'd experienced in Philadelphia, where affection had turned to betrayal so quickly. It still made her head spin. She pushed the thoughts away and focused on preparing for her meeting with Sarah Donovan. She needed to reach this hurting child, needed to prove to herself that she could make a difference here, that leaving Philadelphia and everything she'd known had been the right choice. The next day's classes went smoothly, though Katherine found herself distracted by the approaching 4 o'clock hour. When the last student finally left, she tidied the room and tried to calm her nerves. This was about a student, she reminded herself. Only about a student. Jackson and Sarah arrived precisely at 4. Sarah Donovan was small for 10, all dark hair and sharp eyes that assessed Katherine with open suspicion. She stood close to her father, her hand gripping his, but there was defiance in the set of her jaw that Katherine recognized. This was a child who'd learned to protect herself by pushing people away. "Sarah, this is Miss Walsh," Jackson said gently. "Miss Walsh, my daughter Sarah." "Hello, Sarah," Katherine said, keeping her voice warm but not overly enthusiastic. Children could smell false cheer from a mile away. "Thank you for coming to visit me." Sarah didn't respond, just stared at Katherine with those assessing eyes. "Would you like to see the schoolhouse?" Katherine asked. "You don't have to decide about attending. Just look around, see what you think." After a long moment, Sarah gave a tiny nod. Jackson released her hand, though Katherine noticed the reluctance in the gesture, as if letting go physically hurt him. Katherine showed Sarah around the room, explaining how she organized the students, showing her the books they used, the slates for writing. Sarah remained silent, but Katherine could see her taking it all in, her sharp mind working behind those guarded eyes. "Can I ask you something?" Katherine said when they'd completed the circuit of the room, another small nod. "What do you like to do?" "When you're at the ranch, what makes you happy?" For the first time, something flickered in Sarah's expression. "I help Papa with the horses. I'm good with them. Better than most of the ranch hands." "I bet you are," Katherine said, meaning it. "Do you know what might make you even better?" Sarah's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but she shook her head. "Understanding numbers and measurements helps with feeding schedules, knowing how much grain each horse needs based on their size and work. Reading helps you understand veterinary guides, learn about different breeds and their care. Writing helps you keep records, communicate with buyers." Katherine crouched down to Sarah's level. "Education doesn't take you away from the things you love, Sarah. It gives you tools to do them better." Sarah considered this, her brow furrowed. "Papa can't read much, and he's the best rancher around." "Your papa is exceptional," Katherine agreed, aware of Jackson standing by the door, listening. "But imagine how much more he could do if he could read contracts before signing them, write letters to buyers himself instead of relying on others, keep detailed records of his herd." "Could you teach Papa too?" The question came out quickly, as if Sarah had been holding it back. "Not just me." Katherine's heart twisted at the hope in the girl's voice, the vulnerability beneath the defiance. "If your papa wanted to learn, I would be honored to teach him." She glanced at Jackson, saw surprise and something else flash across his face. He cleared his throat. "Sarah, we're taking up Miss Walsh's time." "No," Katherine said quickly. "You're not. Sarah, would you like to come to school? Try it for a week, see how you like it." Sarah looked from Katherine to her father and back again. "Will you really teach Papa to read better?" "Yes," Katherine promised. "If he wants to learn, I'll teach him." "Then I'll try school," Sarah said, and the small smile that touched her lips transformed her entire face. For a week. After they left, Katherine sat at her desk for a long time, thinking about what she'd just committed to. Teaching Jackson Donovan meant spending time with him, more time than was probably wise given the way her traitorous heart reacted to his presence. But she'd made a promise to a hurting child, and she wouldn't break it. Besides, she told herself firmly, teaching a grown man to read was entirely different from the kind of entanglement that had destroyed her life in Philadelphia. This was safe, professional, nothing to worry about. She almost believed it. Sarah appeared at school the next morning, sitting stiffly in the back row, her expression daring anyone to comment on her presence. Katherine treated her exactly like every other student, neither singling her out nor ignoring her, and by lunchtime, she noticed Sarah had relaxed slightly. even participating in a geography lesson about the territories. Jackson came by that evening after the other students had left. Katherine had been expecting him, had prepared herself for his presence, but her preparation proved inadequate. He seemed larger in the empty schoolhouse, more present, and she found herself acutely aware of being alone with him. "Sarah said she had a good day," he said, holding his hat again in that endearing, nervous gesture. "I can't thank you enough, Miss Walsh. You reached her in a way I couldn't." "She's a bright child," Katherine said. "She just needed to understand the value of education in terms she could relate to." "About what you said yesterday, teaching me to read better," Jackson started, then paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I don't want to impose on your time, and I know I'm probably too old to learn properly, but if you meant it, I'd like to try." "Of course I meant it," Katherine said gently. "And you're not too old, Mr. Donovan. Learning has no age limit." "Jackson," he said, "if you're going to be my teacher, you should call me Jackson." Katherine knew she should maintain formality, should keep proper distance, but there was something in his expression, a mix of hope and vulnerability, that made her nod. "Jackson, then, and you may call me Katherine, at least during our lessons." They arranged to meet 3 evenings a week after dinner, at the schoolhouse where they'd have privacy and access to books. Katherine told herself it was purely practical, that teaching was her profession and Jackson just another student. She ignored the small voice whispering that she was lying to herself. Their first lesson happened 2 days later. Jackson arrived looking nervous, his hair still damp from washing, wearing clean clothes that suggested he'd gone home to change after his ranch work. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Katherine more than it should have. "I should tell you up front," Jackson said as he settled into one of the student benches, looking comically large in the space designed for children. "I know my letters and can sound out simple words. But anything beyond that I struggle. Martha, my wife, she used to help me with the ranch paperwork, read me the important parts of contracts and such. Since she passed, I've been relying on Pete at the general store, and I hate feeling dependent." "Then we'll start with building your confidence," Katherine said, pulling out a primer she'd found among the school supplies. "There's no shame in needing help, Jackson, but I understand wanting independence." They worked through basic reading exercises, Katherine patient as Jackson sounded out words, his brow furrowed in concentration. He made mistakes, got frustrated with himself, but never gave up. Katherine found herself admiring his determination, the way he approached learning with the same quiet strength he seemed to bring to everything else. "That's enough for tonight," she said after an hour, seeing the exhaustion creeping into his features. "You did well, Jackson." "I feel like I'm fighting mud," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Every word is a battle." "It gets easier," Katherine assured him. "Your brain is building new pathways. It feels difficult now because it's new, not because you're incapable." He looked at her with those green eyes, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You're a good teacher, Katherine. Patient. Kind. Sarah's lucky to have you, so am I." Katherine felt heat rising to her cheeks and busied herself with gathering the books to hide her reaction. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Jackson said quietly. "You're doing more than that. You're giving us both something we didn't know we needed." After he left, Katherine sat in the empty schoolhouse, her heart racing, and admitted to herself that this was becoming complicated. Jackson Donovan was nothing like the men she'd known in Philadelphia. He was genuine, hardworking, devoted to his daughter. Everything about him drew her in, made her want to know more, want to be closer. And that terrified her. She'd come west to escape the consequences of trusting the wrong man. She couldn't afford to make that mistake again, no matter how different Jackson seemed. But as the weeks passed, Avoiding her feelings proved impossible. Jackson came faithfully to his lessons 3 times a week, always prepared, always working hard. Katherine watched his skills improve steadily, saw his confidence grow as words that had once been mysteries became readable. She took pride in his progress, and somewhere along the way, her professional satisfaction became tangled with something more personal. It wasn't just the lessons. Jackson started arriving at the schoolhouse earlier, helping her carry water from the well, fixing the wobbly desk, repairing a window shutter that had broken in a windstorm. Small kindnesses, offered quietly, that made Katherine's carefully constructed walls crack a little more each time. And then there was Sarah. The girl bloomed in school, her sharp mind soaking up knowledge like parched earth drinking rain. She started smiling more, making friends with the other students, and the transformation was beautiful to watch. Katherine found herself growing genuinely fond of the child, which only complicated her feelings about the father. It came to a head on October evening 6 weeks after she'd started teaching Jackson. They just finished a particularly good lesson where Jackson had successfully read through an entire page of a dime novel without help. His face when he'd finished, the pure joy in his expression, had made Katherine's heart do that dangerous flip. It had been doing more and more lately. "I did it," he said, looking at her with wonder. "I read a whole page, Katherine. I actually read it." "You did," she confirmed, smiling at his excitement. "You've been working so hard, Jackson. You should be proud of yourself. I couldn't have done it without you." He stood from the bench, closing the distance between them before Katherine could process what was happening. "You've given me more than reading, Katherine. You've given me back a piece of myself I thought I'd lost. You've helped Sarah come back from wherever grief had taken her." "I don't know how to thank you." They were standing too close, close enough that Katherine could see the gold flecks in his green eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She knew she should step back, maintain proper distance, but her feet refused to move. "You don't need to thank me," she managed, her voice coming out breathier than intended. "I'm just happy I could help. Katherine." The way he said her name, soft and full of something she didn't dare name, made her heart race. "I need to tell you something, and I hope it doesn't make things awkward between us, but I've been feeling this for weeks now, and I can't keep pretending I don't." "Jackson, please," Katherine said, finally finding the strength to step back. "Don't." "Why not?" He didn't move closer, but didn't retreat either. "I know it's only been 6 weeks, and maybe that's too soon, but I also lost 2 years with Martha to wasting time. Life out here, it's unpredictable. When you feel something real, you don't ignore it." "You don't know me," Katherine said desperately. "You don't know anything about me, about why I came here. So tell me." Jackson's voice was gentle but firm. "I've shared my grief with you, my struggles. Share yours with me, Katherine." And there it was, the moment she'd been dreading and somehow knew was inevitable. Katherine turned away, moving to the window, staring out at the darkening street. She could feel Jackson behind her, patient, waiting. "I came west because I was running," she said finally, the words tasting like ash. "From Philadelphia, from my family, from a scandal that would have destroyed what was left of my reputation if I'd stayed." She heard Jackson move closer, but kept her eyes on the window. "What kind of scandal?" Katherine took a deep breath. She'd never told this story aloud, never put the pain and humiliation into words. But Jackson deserved the truth, deserved to know what kind of woman he thought he had feelings for. "I was engaged," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, "to a man named Robert Sterling. He was from a good family, wealthy, charming. Everything a Philadelphia girl was supposed to want. We were engaged for 6 months, planning a wedding that was supposed to be the social event of the season." She paused, gathering strength for the next part. Jackson remained silent, giving her space to continue at her own pace. 3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he was already married. Had been for 4 years, to a woman in New York. He kept her and their 2 children secret, visited them twice a month under the guise of business trips. I only found out because I needed to deliver some papers to his office and saw a letter from his wife, asking when he'd be home next. "Katherine, I'm so sorry," Jackson said softly. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. Just said that the marriage was complicated, that his wife didn't understand him the way I did, that we could still be together if I was willing to be discreet. Katherine laughed bitterly at the memory. As if I would become his mistress while he kept an unsuspecting wife hidden away. "What did you do?" I ended the engagement immediately, told my parents everything. But Robert, he was clever. He spread rumors that I'd broken things off because I'd been unfaithful, that I'd tried to blame him to cover my own indiscretions. Some people believed him. Enough people that my reputation was in tatters. My father's business associates stopped calling. My mother's friends whispered behind their hands. I became the scandal, the fallen woman, the cautionary tale mothers would tell their daughters. She turned finally to face Jackson, needing to see his reaction. So I ran. I found that advertisement for a teaching position in a place so far from Philadelphia that no one would know my name or my story. I came here to start over, to escape what I'd become in their eyes. But I'm not running anymore, Jackson. I can't run from this. It's part of who I am now. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Katherine braced herself for disappointment, for the withdrawal she'd seen in others when confronted with scandal. But when Jackson finally spoke, his words weren't what she expected. "That man was a fool," he said simply. "To have someone like you and risk it for lies and deception. And those people in Philadelphia, they're fools too, for believing his stories over your truth. You don't think less of me?" Katherine asked, hardly daring to hope. "Less of you?" Jackson looked genuinely confused. "Katherine, you did the right thing, the brave thing. You stood up for yourself and your principles even when it cost you everything. How could I think less of you for that?" Something inside Katherine cracked open, something that had been locked tight since the day she discovered Robert's betrayal. Tears burned behind her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. "I thought you'd be disappointed," she whispered. "Finding out I'd been engaged before, that I'd been involved in scandal." Jackson crossed the space between them in 2 strides, and this time when he took her hands, Katherine didn't pull away. "The only thing I'm disappointed about is that you carried this alone for so long. That you thought I'd judge you for being hurt by someone else's cruelty. I don't know how to do this," Katherine confessed. "I don't know how to trust again, how to believe that someone's feelings are real and not just another pretty lie." "Then let me show you," Jackson said. "Not with words, they're too easy. Let me show you with time and actions. Let me prove that what I feel is real, that I'm not him, that not all men are like him." Katherine looked up into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity, nothing but genuine care. It terrified her, this vulnerability, but it also felt like the first honest thing she'd experienced in months. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "So am I," Jackson said. "I haven't felt anything like this since Martha died. It scares me too, Katherine. But I've learned that the things worth having are usually the things that scare us most." He raised one of her hands to his lips, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned and sweet, and it made Katherine's heart ache with longing. "Let me court you properly," Jackson said. "Come to dinner at the ranch on Sunday. Meet Sarah in her own home, see where we live. No pressure, no expectations. Just a meal between friends if that's all you're ready for." Katherine knew she should say no, should maintain distance, should protect herself from the possibility of more hurt. But looking at Jackson, Feeling the warmth of his hand around hers, she found herself nodding. "Just dinner," she said. "As friends." The smile that lit Jackson's face was worth every ounce of fear. "As friends," he agreed. Sunday arrived too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Katherine changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Mrs. Henley watched the preparations with knowing eyes but mercifully kept her comments to herself, only mentioning that the blue was very becoming. Jackson arrived at noon in a wagon that had been scrubbed clean, wearing what were clearly his best clothes. The sight of him, nervous and handsome and so obviously trying to make a good impression, made Katherine smile despite her own nerves. "You look beautiful," he said as he helped her into the wagon. "Thank you," Katherine said, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." The ride to the ranch took about 30 minutes, following a well-worn path west from town. Jackson pointed out landmarks as they went, telling her stories about the land, the cattle, the challenges of ranching in Wyoming. Katherine found herself relaxing as she listened, caught up in his obvious love for this life he'd built. The ranch itself was more impressive than Katherine had expected. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from local timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. Outbuildings dotted the landscape behind it. Corrals held horses and cattle, and in the distance, she could see more cattle grazing on the open range. "Martha and I built the house ourselves," Jackson said as he helped Katherine down from the wagon. "Well, we had help from the ranch hands, but we did most of the work. It took 2 years, but she designed every room, chose where every window should go." There was grief in his voice, but also pride, and Katherine understood. This house was a monument to his love for his late wife, a physical manifestation of what they'd built together. Sarah burst out of the house before they reached the porch, her face bright with excitement. "You came. Papa said you would, but I was afraid you might change your mind." "I promised I would come," Katherine said gently. "I don't break my promises, Sarah." The interior of the house was comfortable and well-maintained, though Katherine noticed the lack of decorative touches that a woman might have added. The furniture was sturdy but plain, the windows bare of curtains, the walls empty of pictures or decorations. It was a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Sarah gave Katherine an enthusiastic tour while Jackson disappeared into the kitchen to check on the meal. The girls' room was on the 2nd floor, neat but sparse, with a rope bed covered in a simple quilt and a trunk for her clothes. The only personal touch was a small framed photograph on the bedside table, showing a young woman with Sarah's dark eyes and a gentle smile. "That's Mama," Sarah said, touching the frame gently. "She died when I was 8. I try to remember everything about her, but sometimes I forget things and that scares me." Katherine's heart ached for this child carrying such heavy grief. "What do you remember best about her?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Her voice. She used to sing to me at bedtime, lullabies and folk songs. Sometimes I wake up and think I can still hear her singing." "Then that's what you hold on to," Katherine said softly. "The things that made her special to you. And it's okay to forget small things, Sarah. The love doesn't fade even if the details do." Sarah looked at Katherine with such trust in her eyes that Katherine felt the weight of responsibility settle over her. This child had lost one mother already. If things with Jackson didn't work out, would Sarah feel abandoned again? Dinner was surprisingly good. A roasted chicken with vegetables and fresh bread. Jackson explained that he'd learned to cook out of necessity after Martha died, taught himself through trial and error with help from a cookbook Martha had owned. "The first few months, Sarah and I survived mostly on beans and burned biscuits," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "But I got better. Had to, for Sarah's sake. They talked easily through the meal, Sarah chattering about school and the new foal in the barn, Jackson sharing stories about the ranch. Katherine felt herself relaxing into the warmth of it, the simple domesticity of sharing a meal with people who genuinely seemed to enjoy her company. After dinner, Sarah begged to show Katherine the foal, and they all walked out to the barn in the golden afternoon light. The foal was indeed adorable, all gangly legs and curious eyes, and Katherine couldn't help but laugh as it nuzzled her hand looking for treats. "She's beautiful," Katherine said, stroking the foal's soft nose. "She's Sarah's," Jackson said. "Her responsibility. She's been doing a good job caring for her." The pride in his voice made Sarah beam, and Katherine saw the bond between father and daughter, how much they meant to each other. The thought of becoming part of this small family that had survived so much grief, was both terrifying and deeply appealing. They sat on the porch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah sat between them, leaning against her father, and the contentment on her face made Katherine's chest tight. "I like having you here, Miss Walsh," Sarah said sleepily. "It feels nice, having a lady in the house again." Over Sarah's head, Jackson's eyes met Katherine's, and the question in them was clear. Could this work? Could they build something here? Katherine didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt something like hope. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Katherine taught school during the day, meeting with Jackson 3 evenings a week for his reading lessons. But those lessons began to extend beyond just education. They talked about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Jackson told her about his childhood on a small farm in Kansas, about coming west to build something of his own, about meeting and falling in love with Martha. Katherine shared more about her life in Philadelphia, not just the scandal but the good parts too, the dreams she'd had before everything fell apart. Jackson began finding excuses to come to town more often, stopping by the schoolhouse to fix things that weren't really broken, to bring Katherine wildflowers he claimed were from Sarah, to ask her opinions on books he should read next. Katherine knew what he was doing and couldn't quite bring herself to discourage him. And then there were the Sunday dinners at the ranch, which became a regular occurrence. Katherine would help Sarah with her lessons, play games with the girl, and slowly she watched the house start to come back to life. Sarah picked wildflowers for the table. Katherine helped her make simple curtains for the kitchen windows. Jackson brought home a rocking chair he'd built in the evenings, placing it on the porch where Katherine liked to sit and watch the sunset. They were building something, the three of them, even if no one was ready to name it yet. November brought the first serious snow, and with it, a crisis. One of Jackson's ranch hands came racing into town on a Saturday afternoon, his horse lathered and his face grim. Katherine was at the general store when he burst in, demanding to know where the doctor was. "Doc's out at the Morrison place," Pete said. "Their baby's coming early. What's wrong?" "Mr. Donovan's been hurt," the ranch hand, a young man named Tom, said breathlessly. "Horse threw him and he hit his head on a rock. He's conscious but bleeding bad, and Sarah's beside herself. We need help." Katherine didn't think, just acted. "I'll come. I have some medical training." It was a slight exaggeration. She'd taken a basic nursing course at her seminary, but that had been years ago. Still, it was better than nothing. Tom didn't question it, just helped her into the saddle of a horse Pete provided. The ride to the ranch was terrifying, the horse moving faster than Katherine had ever ridden, but fear for Jackson pushed everything else aside. They found him in the main house, lying on the sofa with a blood-soaked cloth pressed to his head. Sarah sat beside him, her face white, holding his hand. When she saw Katherine, The relief in her expression was palpable. "Miss Walsh, Papa's hurt, and he won't let Tom fetch the doctor even though he's bleeding everywhere and I'm so scared." Katherine knelt beside the sofa, gently removing the cloth to examine the wound. It was a nasty gash along Jackson's temple, still bleeding sluggishly, but the skull beneath seemed intact. His eyes were open and tracking, which was a good sign. "Just a scratch," Jackson mumbled, trying to sit up. Katherine pushed him back down with more force than strictly necessary. "Lay still," she ordered. "Sarah, I need clean water, clean cloths, and the whiskey your father keeps for medicinal purposes." Sarah scrambled to obey, clearly grateful to have something to do. Katherine examined the rest of Jackson's head carefully, checking his pupils, asking him questions to assess his mental state. He seemed lucid, if in pain, and she allowed herself to relax slightly. "What happened?" she asked as she cleaned the wound, Jackson wincing under her ministrations. "Stupid accident," he said through gritted teeth. "Young stallion got spooked by a snake, threw me straight into a boulder. My own fault for not paying attention." "You could have been killed," Katherine said, and the tremor in her voice betrayed more emotion than she'd intended. Jackson's good hand found hers, squeezed gently. "I'm fine, Katherine. Hard head, remember. This is not fine," Katherine said, gesturing to the gash. "This needs stitches, Jackson, proper medical stitches." "Can you do it?" he asked. "I don't want to wait hours for Doc to finish at the Morrisons'. It's just a cut." Katherine wanted to argue but knew he was right. The doctor could be gone for hours if there were complications with the birth. And while the wound wasn't life-threatening, it did need to be closed soon to prevent infection. "I can try," she said reluctantly, "but it's going to hurt." "I've had worse," Jackson said, attempting a smile that came out more like a grimace. Katherine had Sarah boil the needle and thread, poured whiskey over both the wound and her own hands, and said a quick prayer that she remembered enough from her nursing training. Jackson refused to look away, watching her face as she worked, and his steady gaze somehow made her hands steadier. The stitching took longer than she'd hoped, each careful stitch making Jackson's jaw tighten but drawing no complaint. By the time she finished and bandaged the wound properly, Katherine's hands were shaking with released tension. "There," she said, sitting back. "You'll have a scar, but at least your head is in one piece." "Thank you," Jackson said softly. "For coming, for taking care of me. You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did," Katherine said, suddenly aware that Sarah was watching them with interest, that Tom and the other ranch hands were trying not to stare. "You'd do the same for anyone who needed help." But they both knew it was more than that. Katherine had been terrified riding to the ranch, had felt her heart stop when she saw him bleeding. This wasn't just concern for a friend or a student. This was something deeper, something she'd been trying not to acknowledge. The doctor arrived 2 hours later, having successfully delivered the Morrison baby. He examined Jackson's wound, pronounced Katherine's stitching adequate if not elegant, and gave strict orders for rest and observation. "Someone should stay with him tonight," Doc said. "Head wounds can be tricky." "He shouldn't be alone." "I'll stay," Katherine said before she could think better of it. "Sarah shouldn't have to bear that responsibility." There was a moment of awkward silence. A single woman staying overnight at a bachelor's home, even for nursing purposes, was pushing the boundaries of propriety. But Doc just nodded. "Good. Keep him awake for a few more hours, make sure he's lucid. If he starts getting confused or throwing up, send for me immediately." After the doctor left, Katherine helped Jackson up to his room, Sarah hovering anxiously. The room was Spartan, much like the rest of the house, with a large bed, a dresser, and little else. Katherine tried not to think about the intimacy of being in his private space. She settled Jackson into bed, over his protests that he was fine and she was making a fuss. Sarah brought dinner up on a tray, and the three of them ate together in the bedroom, Sarah chattering to fill the nervous silence. Eventually, Katherine convinced Sarah to go to her own room and sleep. The girl went reluctantly, making Katherine promise to wake her if Papa got worse. Once they were alone, the room seemed to shrink, becoming far too intimate for Katherine's peace of mind. "You don't have to stay," Jackson said, though his eyes said otherwise. "I know this isn't proper." "Proper doesn't matter when someone's hurt," Katherine said firmly. "Besides, Sarah needs to sleep, and you need supervision. I'm staying." She pulled the room's single chair next to the bed, settling in with a book she'd grabbed from downstairs. Jackson watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Katherine, I need to say something." "You should rest, not talk," Katherine said, not looking up from her book. "Please, let me say this while I have the courage." Jackson's voice was serious enough that Katherine set the book aside. "When I was lying there with my head cracked open, all I could think about was you. Not about dying, not about Sarah being left alone, just you. How much I wanted to see you again, hear your voice, tell you how I feel." "Jackson," Katherine started, but he held up a hand. "I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I know it's only been a few months. I know you're still healing from what happened in Philadelphia. I know you have every reason not to trust me or my feelings. But I've been alive long enough to know what love feels like, and this is it. You make me want to be better, to learn more, to build a future instead of just surviving. You've brought life back to this house, light back to Sarah's eyes, hope back to my heart." Katherine felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. "I'm scared, Jackson. I'm so scared of being hurt again, of trusting the wrong person, of making another mistake." "I know," he said gently. "And I'm not asking you to stop being scared. I'm just asking you to be scared with me instead of alone, to give us a chance to see where this could go." Katherine stood, moving to sit on the edge of the bed, close enough to take his hand. "What if I'm not ready? What if I can't be what you and Sarah need?" "You're already what we need," Jackson said, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "Just by being yourself. By being kind and patient and strong. By showing up when we needed you, even when it was hard. That's all we need, Katherine. Just you, exactly as you are." Katherine looked at their joined hands, at the calluses on his fingers from hard work, at the strength and gentleness in his touch. She thought about how he'd been so patient with her, never pushing, always respecting her boundaries. She thought about Sarah, about the love she already felt for that brave, hurting child. She thought about this house, this ranch, this life so different from anything she'd known in Philadelphia. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd become since leaving Philadelphia. Stronger, braver, more certain of her own worth. The scandal hadn't broken her. Robert's betrayal hadn't destroyed her capacity to trust. She'd survived, and she was still here, still capable of feeling, still worthy of love. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and right. "I've been fighting it for weeks, telling myself it was too soon, that I couldn't trust it. But I do, Jackson, I love you." The smile that transformed his face was worth every moment of fear. He reached up with his free hand, cupping her cheek, drawing her down until their foreheads touched gently, mindful of his injury. "Say it again," he breathed. "I love you," Katherine repeated, stronger this time. "I love you, and I'm terrified, and I still don't know if I'm ready for all of this, but I want to try." "That's all I need," Jackson said, and then he was kissing her, soft and sweet and full of promise. They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, hands clasped, breathing the same air. Outside, snow began to fall again, coating the ranch in white silence. Inside, something new was being born, fragile and precious and full of possibility. Katherine stayed awake through the night, watching Jackson sleep, checking periodically to make sure he was breathing normally, that his pupils were responsive. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she dozed off in the chair, waking to find early morning light filtering through the windows and Jackson watching her with tender eyes. "Good morning," he said softly. "How's my nurse?" "Exhausted," Katherine admitted, stretching her stiff muscles. "How's your head?" "Hurts like hell, but I'll live." He reached for her hand again, that gesture becoming familiar already. "Katherine, about last night, what I said, what you said, I meant it," she interrupted. "Every word, did you?" "Every word," he confirmed, "but I want to do this right. Court you properly, give you time, not rush you into anything before you're ready." Katherine smiled, feeling something warm and bright expanding in her chest. "I'd like that. Though I think we might be doing things slightly backward, considering I just spent the night in your bedroom." Jackson laughed, then winced, pressing a hand to his bandaged head. "Don't make me laugh, it hurts." Sarah appeared in the doorway, still in her nightgown, relief flooding her face when she saw her father awake and talking. "Papa, you're okay." "Come here, sweetheart," Jackson said, and Sarah flew across the room to hug him carefully. "I'm fine. Miss Walsh took good care of me." Sarah turned to Katherine, and the gratitude in her young face was overwhelming. "Thank you for staying with him. Thank you for making him better." "Of course, Sarah," Katherine said gently. "I wouldn't have been anywhere else." Over the next few weeks, as Jackson recovered from his injury, their relationship deepened in quiet, steady ways. Jackson couldn't work for a while, doctor's orders, so Katherine started spending more time at the ranch, helping with small tasks, keeping him company during the long days of forced rest. She brought books from the schoolhouse, and they read together by the fire while Sarah did her homework at the table. It was domestic and peaceful, and felt almost dangerously comfortable. Katherine watched Jackson with Sarah, saw how patient and loving he was, how he encouraged her education while respecting her love of ranch work. She saw a partnership forming between them, a family structure that had space for her if she wanted it. The town, of course, noticed the increased time Katherine spent at the Donovan ranch. Mrs. Henley asked pointed questions about when she might expect wedding announcements. Students whispered and giggled when Jackson came to pick Sarah up from school. Katherine felt the weight of small-town scrutiny, but found she cared less than she'd expected. In Philadelphia, scandal had destroyed her because she'd cared so deeply about what others thought. Here in El Dorado, with Jackson's steady presence and Sarah's unconditional affection, other people's opinions seemed less important. She was building a life based on her own choices, her own values, and that felt like freedom. December brought bitter cold and more snow, and with it, a letter that made Katherine's blood run cold. Mrs. Henley brought it to the schoolhouse one afternoon, her expression curious about the Philadelphia postmark. Katherine waited until she was alone to open it, her hands shaking as she unfolded the expensive stationery. The handwriting was her mother's, precise and elegant. The letter was brief and devastating. Robert Sterling had been arrested for fraud, his scheme of maintaining multiple false identities finally catching up with him. Turned out the wife in New York wasn't his only secret. There had been 3 other women, all engaged or married to him under different names, all being swindled of their money and dignity. The scandal had exploded across Philadelphia society, vindicating Katherine completely. Her mother wrote that everyone now understood Katherine had been telling the truth, that she was welcomed back with open arms, that several eligible men had already expressed interest in courting her. Katherine read the letter twice, then set it down with trembling hands. She should feel vindicated. She should feel triumph that the truth had finally emerged. Instead, She just felt sad for all the women Robert had hurt, and grateful that she'd escaped before he could damage her further. That evening, she took the letter to Jackson, finding him in the barn checking on the horses. He read it in the lamplight, his expression growing darker with each line. "He hurt other women," Jackson said quietly. "Could have hurt you worse if you'd stayed." "I know," Katherine said. "My mother wants me to come home, says my reputation is restored, that I can have the life I left behind." Jackson looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw fear in his eyes. "What do you want to do?" Katherine took the letter from his hands, walked over to the lantern, and held the paper to the flame. They watched it burn together, the expensive stationery turning to ash. "I want to stay here," Katherine said firmly. "This is my home now. You and Sarah, this ranch, this life. That's what I want." Jackson pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "Are you sure? You could have everything back, Katherine, your family, your status, the life you were meant for." "I was never meant for that life," Katherine said into his chest. "I know that now. I was meant for this, for you." Jackson drew back just far enough to kiss her, deep and thorough and full of relief and love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were bright. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you're burning bridges with Philadelphia, not because it's expected or proper. Marry me because you want to build a life here with me and Sarah. Marry me because you love me as much as I love you." Katherine felt tears on her cheeks but didn't bother to wipe them away. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jackson Donovan." They told Sarah that night over dinner, and the girl's shriek of joy probably carried all the way to town. She threw her arms around Katherine, nearly knocking her out of her chair, babbling about how she'd hoped and prayed for this, how perfect it was, how Katherine was going to be her new mother. Later, after Sarah had finally gone to bed, still too excited to sleep, Katherine and Jackson sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Jackson admitted. "After Martha died, I thought that part of my life was over. That I'd had my great love and should be grateful for the time we had. I don't want to replace her," Katherine said carefully, "for you or for Sarah. She was Sarah's mother and she was your wife. That's important." "You're not replacing her," Jackson said. "You're something different. Martha and I grew up together, married young, built this ranch from nothing. We had a good life, a good love. But it was the love of youth, of growing up together. What I feel for you, it's different. Deeper somehow, because we both know how fragile happiness is, how quickly it can be lost. That makes it more precious, not less." Katherine understood. Her love for Jackson wasn't the naive infatuation she'd felt for Robert. It was built on truth and trust and genuine knowledge of each other's flaws and strengths. It was a grown woman's love, earned and chosen, not just fallen into. They set the wedding for January, giving Katherine time to finish the school term before the holiday break. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church that served El Dorado's faithful. Katherine wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Henley had helped her make, and Sarah stood up with her, beaming with pride. Jackson looked devastating in his Sunday best, his hair neatly trimmed, the scar from his injury still visible at his temple, a reminder of the night everything had changed between them. When he looked at Katherine walking down the aisle, the love in his eyes made her knees weak. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows written by the traveling preacher who served the circuit, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges life brought. When Jackson slipped the simple gold band onto Katherine's finger, she felt the last of her fear fall away. This was right. This was home. The reception at the boarding house was loud and joyful, the whole town celebrating with food and music. Katherine danced with Jackson, with Sarah, with half the men in town who wanted to congratulate the bride. Somewhere around midnight, Jackson finally claimed her for another dance, pulling her close as the fiddle played a slow waltz. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Donovan," he murmured in her ear. "Mrs. Donovan." Katherine tested the name in her mind and found she loved it. More than ready. They slipped away while the party continued, Sarah staying at the boarding house with Mrs. Henley for the night to give them privacy. The ride to the ranch in the moonlight felt like a dream. Katherine tucked against Jackson's side, both of them warm despite the January cold. The house was dark when they arrived, but Jackson had left lamps burning low, creating a warm glow. He swept Katherine up in his arms at the threshold, carrying her inside despite her laughing protests. "It's tradition," he said, setting her down gently in the parlor. "Carrying my bride over the threshold." Katherine looked around the house, really seeing it for the first time as hers. Not just a place she visited, but her home. Her and Jackson's home. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Jackson must have sensed her nerves because he took her hands gently. "We don't have to rush anything, Katherine. We have the rest of our lives." But Katherine shook her head. She'd waited long enough, been cautious long enough. "I'm not afraid anymore, Jackson. Not of this. Not with you." Their wedding night was everything Katherine had hoped for and nothing like she'd feared. Jackson was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she felt loved and cherished. When Katherine finally fell asleep in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt more at peace than she ever had in her life. The months that followed were an adjustment. Katherine had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and physical demands. She continued teaching, though having a husband and stepdaughter in her class took some getting used to. Sarah started calling her mother Katherine, then just mother, and each time the word filled Katherine with fierce joy. Spring came with its chaos of calving season. Summer brought the hard work of haying and dealing with the heat. Katherine learned to cook for ranch hands, to help with branding, to manage the house while Jackson managed the land. It was exhausting and exhilarating, and nothing like the life she'd left behind in Philadelphia. Letters came occasionally from her mother, growing warmer as time passed, accepting that Katherine had chosen a different path. Katherine wrote back, describing her life with honesty, and slowly, a new relationship with her family formed, one based on mutual respect rather than obligation. A year after their wedding, Katherine realized she was pregnant. She told Jackson on a warm June evening as they sat on the porch watching Sarah practice riding in the corral. He was so stunned he couldn't speak for a full minute, then pulled her into his arms and held her like she was made of glass. Sarah was thrilled at the prospect of a baby brother or sister, immediately taking on the role of helpful older sibling. She helped Katherine prepare the nursery, painting the small room next to theirs in cheerful yellow, sewing tiny clothes with more enthusiasm than skill. The pregnancy was difficult, and there were moments when Katherine was frightened, when the isolation of ranch life felt overwhelming. But Jackson was steadfast, and the doctor came regularly to check on her, and Mrs. Henley made the trip out twice a week to help and offer encouragement. In February of 1880, Katherine gave birth to a son. The labor was long and hard, but when Jackson finally placed the squalling infant in her arms, every moment of pain was forgotten. The baby had Jackson's green eyes and a shock of dark hair, and Katherine fell instantly, completely in love. They named him James, after Jackson's father. Sarah insisted on helping with everything, learning to change diapers and rock her baby brother to sleep. Watching her blossom into a caring older sister was almost as wonderful as being a mother herself. Life settled into a new rhythm. Katherine took a year away from teaching to focus on James, returning to the classroom when he was old enough to spend mornings with Mrs. Henley in town. The juggling act of being wife, mother, and teacher was exhausting, but Katherine had never been happier. 2 years later, another baby arrived, a daughter they named Martha after Jackson's first wife. Katherine had suggested the name, wanting to honor the woman who'd loved Jackson first, who'd given him Sarah. Jackson had cried when she proposed it, and Sarah had hugged her so tight Katherine couldn't breathe. The ranch prospered. Jackson's herd grew, his reputation as a fair dealer spreading throughout Wyoming territory. They added onto the house, creating more bedrooms for the growing family, a proper parlor for entertaining, a study where Katherine could prepare lessons and Jackson could manage the ranch's increasingly complex paperwork. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman, graduating from Katherine's school at 16 and choosing to stay at the ranch, learning the business from her father. She had her mother Martha's gentle spirit and Jackson's strong will, and watching her become her own person was a privilege Katherine treasured. The years passed in a blur of seasons. Wyoming Territory became a state in 1890, and Jackson and Katherine voted together for the first time, Wyoming being one of the first places to grant women that right. James and Martha grew from babies to children to young people with their own dreams and ambitions. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Katherine back to the spot where he'd first told her he loved her, the bedroom where she'd nursed him after his injury. The house had changed so much since then, filled with children and life and love, but that room remained largely the same. "Do you ever regret it?" Jackson asked as they stood by the window, looking out at the ranch, at everything they'd built together. "Leaving Philadelphia, marrying me, choosing this life." Katherine turned to face him, taking in the silver threading through his dark hair, the deeper lines around his eyes, the hands roughened by decades of hard work. He was older now, they both were, but the love in his eyes was the same as the day they'd married. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I didn't know I needed, Jackson. A home, a family, a purpose. You taught me that love could be real and lasting, that trust could be rebuilt, that starting over didn't mean running away from the past but building a better future." "You saved me too," Jackson said softly. "Sarah and I were just surviving before you came. You brought us back to life, gave us a reason to thrive instead of just exist." They held each other as the sun set over the ranch, over the life they'd built, over the love that had started with fear and caution and grown into something unshakable. Sarah married at 20, choosing a good man from a neighboring ranch, and gave them their first grandchild a year later. James left at 18 to study veterinary medicine in Denver, determined to come back and help ranchers care for their animals better. Martha, at 16, was already showing promise as a teacher, working with Katherine at the schoolhouse and dreaming of opening a school of her own someday. On a spring evening in 1895, 17 years after Katherine had first arrived in El Dorado running from scandal and shame, she sat on the porch with Jackson, watching their grandchildren play in the yard while Sarah and her husband visited. The scene was chaotic and loud and perfect. "Do you remember that first Sunday I came to dinner?" Katherine asked, her hand finding Jackson's automatically. "When I was so nervous I changed dresses 3 times. Jackson laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and being terrified you'd see through me to the barely literate rancher beneath." "I saw exactly who you were," Katherine said. "A good man, a loving father, someone worth taking a chance on. I'm so glad I did, Jackson. I'm so glad I stopped running and stayed." "I'm glad you stayed too," Jackson said, pulling her close. Every single day I'm grateful you chose us, chose this life, chose me. As the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The scandal that had driven her from Philadelphia seemed like something from another lifetime, something that had happened to another woman entirely. She'd traveled west to start over, to escape, to hide from shame and judgment, but she'd found so much more. She'd found purpose in teaching, joy in motherhood, partnership in marriage. She'd found a home in this wild, beautiful place among people who valued character over pedigree, honesty over pretense. She'd found love with a man who saw her completely and loved her anyway, who'd been patient when she was afraid and steady when she needed support. Most importantly, she'd found herself. Not the person Philadelphia society had tried to mold her into, not the scandal they'd tried to define her as, but her truest self. Strong and capable, loving and loved, part of something bigger than herself. The rancher had given her a reason to stop running, but what she'd discovered in stopping was that she'd been running toward this all along. Toward home, toward family, toward the life she was always meant to live. The journey had been hard, the destination uncertain, but standing here on this porch with Jackson's arm around her, surrounded by the family they'd built together, Katherine knew every step had been worth it. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed her arrival all those years ago, Katherine made a silent promise to that frightened young woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach in Dorado. "Thank you," she thought. "Thank you for being brave enough to run, and even braver to stop running. Thank you for taking the chance, for trusting again, for believing in new beginnings." The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities and unknowns. But Katherine faced it without fear because she wasn't alone anymore. She had Jackson beside her, their children and grandchildren around them, and a love that had been tested and proven true. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the way they'd faced everything else, and that was more than enough. It was everything.